Thanks, Lisa. And I'm so happy to be here. I was thinking back to past Trails Coalition meetings, like being in Wenatchee and being in the Pickering Barn in Issaquah. And then there was 2020 and now this virtual room. So thanks for being here. I need to quickly ask Jacob in tech support to enable me to share my screen so I can put my PowerPoint up. There we go. All righty. All those fun things. So you can check that off on your conference bingo card. My name is Barb Chamberlain. I am the director of the Active Transportation Division at WSDOT. And with me today is my colleague, Brian Wood. And we're going to tag team on some slides. They help keep us on track for time and prompt us on a few things, but this is not a read all the slides to you presentation exactly. We do want to send these out as a PDF so that you have them for reference as well. And I'm just going to see if I can turn on captioning. Yes, to make it a little bit more accessible to folks. And with that, what we're going to talk about today, just a very light touch on the Active Transportation Plan, Part 1, which we already released, and it's final, it's on the web, to give you a touch on a couple of the core concepts and really as they relate to trails. And we think about trails as wonderful for their own sake and also as core transportation corridors, whether they're connecting towns or connecting people inside a town. They're really valuable elements of the total transportation system. And Brian will share more on one of our key elements, talking about level of traffic stress and a concept we laid out in Part 1. And then we will say probably 50 times, comment on Part 2 by midnight tomorrow night. I know that's tight, but you got advance notice on this from Lisa and team. This is the chapters that talk about performance metrics. So how will we measure progress and success? And strategies, how do we actually achieve progress and success? And what I'm going to do today is touch on those that are really specifically naming trails, but there are many concepts in this draft that relate to trail progress. In particular, there's an appendix listing local plans. And we did this inventory a while back. We used some keywords, but not all that we could. And we are in search of any plans that really point to facilities and things like there's going to be a trail coming through here and we need a crossing across a state route, that kind of thing. So help us update Appendix G by using the comment form on the plan open house, and we'll make sure you have that link in the chat as well. The goals in our plan really tie into not only transportation policy goals, but goals in other parts of state statute and federal law. So the brief list is connectivity, safety, opportunity, participation, and partnership. And the way we've approached this is to really emphasize connectivity because you need to be able to get where you're going and to recognize that we can only get connectivity by working in partnership. And if we get connectivity working with partners, then we will increase and enhance safety, opportunity, and participation. And today I'll talk especially about the safety and opportunity pieces. Got a slide I'm going to fly past that is a reference slide. The many policy goals that active transportation directly contributes to. We have to do a plan under state law, but we're also contributing to the Clean Air Act and reductions in vehicle miles traveled that are a new state law and a number of other elements. So no matter what we do, we're moving forward on somebody's goals. The plan, when you look at it, if you looked back at the old plan, which was done in 2008, it wouldn't feel the same. This was not an update of an old plan. This was a complete rewrite from scratch. And what we really did was emphasize looking at state routes because we have not had, as an agency, a way to objectively evaluate state routes and say, how good are they for active transportation? Lo and behold, surprise, surprise, they weren't actually built for that in the first place. So they're not awesome everywhere. And so we arrived at a level of traffic stress as a way to evaluate state routes. We focused on population centers in particular. Those are either the incorporated cities and towns, or they are those places where land use has started to fill in an unincorporated area. And the census actually designates these as places. So you might not live in a town, you might live in a, I might not even actually realize that. So some of these places are surprisingly large. Spanaway has a population of 27,000, and it's not a city or a town as we talk about incorporation. So that's why we wanted to focus on population centers. But we also don't want to ignore those long spaces between, and that's where that statewide network concept that Brian will talk about comes into play. We use demographic information to help us understand and then ultimately to address a really disproportionate serious injuries and deaths. And I'll have a couple of slides on the equity data and the safety data. So with that, I will move to the equity data. And we, for the last 4 years, have been putting out a crash analysis. We do an annual active transportation safety report. And we've been doing an equity analysis and saying, we don't always know the individual characteristics of a person who is struck and injured or killed. We know the place where it happened. And so what can we understand about that place and in particular about the history of that place? And so we know we have the effects of transportation and land use decisions. We know that redlining led to having wider, faster, busier roads and more highways through those places and neighborhoods that would have higher proportions of Indigenous and Black and people of color living there. That was a deliberate policy decision, and it has effects that show up today. And we have then, following on that, the effects of people who live in poverty, also being in particular places with particular kinds of infrastructure. And more recently, if you haven't seen the report from Disability Rights Washington on people who cannot or do not drive because of disability, it's their story map and their white paper both really point to this. These are folks who are very reliant on active transportation connections and transit. So that's all in play in our plan. In safety data, I won't dwell on this except to say that it's crossings and speed. People get struck and killed if they're trying to cross the road. And that might be a trail connection across that road. And they are more likely to die if the driver is going faster. That's just physics. In both Target Zero and our plan, we point to this inverted pyramid that says that elimination of any chance of a crash is, it sounds sort of silly to have to point this out, but it's the most broadly effective. If you don't get hit, you can't get hurt. But we haven't been designing roads with this kind of approach for vulnerable road users. And so if you think about trails as separated facilities, those are one of the most effective elimination strategies. You're just keeping people away from each other. You keep the people in the large steel boxes away from the soft-shelled creatures on the road, or on the trail rather. So we've analyzed that. The data's all in the plan. I won't spend time on it, but just to let you know, we really appreciate what trails do to provide that separation, high-speed traffic and the volume of traffic. One of the things we think about in design is just that the driver needs time both to see you and to stop. That is how they might end up hitting you if they're going too fast for conditions. We're coming up on Halloween, and we just did a blog post yesterday that more kids die on Halloween than other nights of the year. And we're saying to drivers, that's on you, you need to slow down. So with that, I'm going to bring Brian on deck, and he'll talk about the next few slides, and then I'll be back. And again, drop questions in the Q&A, comments in the chat. We'll put some links in the chat when we get to our Q&A session. Thanks. Take it away, Brian.
Okay. Checking that you can hear me. I don't see my face. I'm seeing yours, though.
Yep, you're good.
All right, that's good. Brian Wood, Active Transportation Division, working with Barb and Charlotte in our giant little division of WSDOT. And so I'm going to start here talking about level of traffic stress. It's a concept that connects roadway safety and user experience with observable roadway characteristics like posted speed, traffic volumes, and number of lanes. WSDOT assigned a 1 to 4 level of traffic stress ranking to all of our state highways and population centers for intersections and roadway segments. Most people walking, rolling a wheelchair, or riding a bike could probably guess the LTS for a given location. For LTS 1 or 2, conditions are either pretty tame or there are tools in place to make it work for most people, which is what we want to see. Unfortunately, many of our roadways and crossings are level of traffic stress 3 and 4, which we call gaps. These only work well for the most agile, observant, and brave people, and are probably unappealing even to those users. And so our goal is to get bike lanes, sidewalks, and safe crossings in population centers, lower speeds there wherever appropriate, and so achieve a level of traffic stress too in the places people hang out the most. In most cases, we can get, in some cases, we can get a level of traffic stress 1 facilities in place, such as trails and pedestrian bridges that completely separate users from traffic. Level of traffic stress is something we think that trail users will be very interested in, given the many roadway crossings that are associated with trails. And if you are looking closely at the trail crossing image on this slide, we are working on rethinking those bollards too. And well, next slide. So here it shows efforts being made to connect trails with highways. The Yakima Greenway has a cross bike / crosswalk hybrid that adds some very strong emphasis to a trail crossing. Buffered bike lanes on State Route 20 in Port Townsend on the right are a good strategy to increase separation between drivers and bicyclists. And the small image there is showing a conspicuous marked crossing with an RFB, or rectangular rapid flashing beacon, that is, where an unpaved trail meets the roadway. Next. Thank you. Trails are often associated with recreation, though many are used as corridors that help active travelers reach work, school, or a grocery store. Conversely, roads are often seen as transport corridors, but they are frequently used for recreation. Washington State participates in the United States Bicycle Route Program that aims to designate a network of bike routes and with offering relatively more value for bicycle tourists than other routes they may choose. The American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, or AASHTO, formally recognizes such network designations, which establish routes that crisscross the United States. I should note that the USBRS program is very similar to the Washington Scenic Bikeways program that is just getting underway through state parks. And we expect to work closely with Washington State Parks to maximize the value of the designations. WSDOT makes the application to AASHTO and does a fair amount of behind the scenes work for the program, but volunteer efforts have really led the charge to get a concept network in place and get jurisdictions on board to support route designation. A bike route is a navigational tool, similar to a driving route like the famous Route 66. It does not indicate the presence of specialized infrastructure to accommodate or encourage bicycling. The value is that such routes point to corridors that may be more scenic, have more shoulder space or lower traffic volumes, and that connect to great places like state parks. Often the routes follow state highways or county roads. To the extent possible, we run United States bike routes on trails. And if a new trail is developed near one, we have the flexibility to realign the route with the trail. At present, we have one route, USBR 10, that crosses the state from east to west. There are a handful of routes started in Whatcom, Skagit, and Island counties, and another set just established in Whitman, Garfield, Asotin, and Columbia counties. The next slide will be showing the established routes and the concept routes that further guide development of the system. And bringing us back to trails, those concept routes also help us think about the potential statewide multi-use trails network as well, which I will also be showing you. So here's that map of the United States bicycle route system. The fat dashed lines are the concept routes, and the other lines are the designated routes. As I noted, this network helped us to think about a statewide trails network, shown on the next slide. Although the United States bicycle route system could be seen as a largely recreational program, similar to the Scenic Bikeways program, and recognizing that roads most certainly serve recreational interests, WSDOT's primary focus is still on transportation, or getting people to and from destinations. And this applies to our interest in trails as well. The active transportation plan, the development effort for that plan included an attempt to inventory existing trails that could be seen as offering active transportation value, even if many of the trails, those owned by state parks, were primarily constructed for recreational purposes. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I'm going to stay here. The total length of the existing trails, the green lines, times an estimated cost per mile to develop them, suggests that our state and jurisdictions have made an estimated $1.75 billion investment in trails that can get people to and from destinations. WSDOT also added locally planned and conceptual trails to our state map, purple lines, and these are not every one of them out there. It's the ones that people sent us. And so we have those. And then we also penciled in some statewide connector concept trails, those gold lines, that largely follow the United States bicycle route concepts from the previous slide, and that help us to link everything into a statewide network. The gold lines of the conceptual network highlight an opportunity and provide a conversation starter. When the Great American Rail Trail planners came to our state and asked where we wanted their cross-country trail to go, we didn't have a statewide plan to refer to and deliberate over. That missing concept plan resulted in some frustrations among attendees invited to the conversation. This first run at a statewide plan for trails with transportation value needs a lot of work and partner coordination. WSDOT may not ultimately be the lead, but our foray into this arena could open the door to better communication and planning overall. To that end, WSDOT is participating in the RCO statewide trails plan and trail database development efforts. And I will turn this back to Barb.
Who will remember to unmute herself. That's another swear on your bingo card. And take us to the next graphic, which I had unfortunately sneak previewed. And I love Megan's comments at the beginning because they set up this graphic from Pathless Pedals beautifully. And this, they're referring to bike tourism in this graphic that shows how bikes can save rural economies. And this graphic predates COVID, but I would say it's even more true now as economies have really suffered, that a bike tourist traveling across the state is fueled by calories. That's how the breweries do so well, is the trail and the bike tourists stopping for refreshments, I think, but be that as it may, cideries too, very important. But you ride, you stop, you fuel, you ride, you stop, you fuel across a state. I can drive across the entire state in a car, maybe stop once at a rest area or a gas station and get to Idaho. And I have spent very little money, and what I spent on gas, most of that will leave the state. If I am a bike tourist, or if I am drawn to be in a place because it has a beautiful trail system, I'm staying and I'm spending at the kinds of businesses that keep the dollars local. So that RCO economic value study tells that story in greater detail, but this is part of what we think about. The transportation system is supposed to support economic vitality. And that's traditionally been thought of in terms of things like freight mobility, maybe tourism in the sense of a car traveler, but understanding that bike travelers are worth more as wallets on wheels is one of the elements for us to keep in mind. So I'm now going to turn to a few highlights from the chapters in the draft plan that, again, we hope you comment on, read and comment on, but we know a lot of people wait till the last minute. So this is the last minute. There are two main chapters. I will say there's an overview of part one and an executive summary, but the chapters to really dig into and comment on are chapters 6 and 7, and that all important appendix with the local plan links. Chapter 6 is performance metrics, and this is how we would track and report on whether things are improving. Some things we're required to report, and so they're going to stay in. If everybody said take out the safety metrics, we would still keep the safety metrics in. These also, because it's a statewide plan, need to be things we can calculate statewide and collect data on over time so that we could, have a trend line that would show how things are changing. So it isn't everything you might want to know. It isn't at the very, very granular level. It doesn't measure how many miles of bike lanes in your town. That's for your city to measure, or your census designated place. The funny thing about both the metrics and the strategies is there's no timelines on any of them because so many of them are really dependent on funding. So we can say we hope to do these things, but it's really incumbent on the legislature to decide how much of this we could do and other funding sources for any kind of active transportation investment. So as you look at the metrics, think about what you would add or revise, or why are you measuring this? I don't understand. That would really be able to let us tell a statewide story about what is happening for active transportation. And where we've said we have some kind of a goal or target, does that feel ambitious and inspiring, intimidating? Are we aiming at the right place, so to speak? So comments like that are really helpful. In some places, we have to say, we don't know the baseline today because we don't have the data. So the goal is to do it all, but we don't actually know where we're starting from. In other places, some of the metrics really have an interaction. So for example, how much we can do to avoid greenhouse gas emissions depends on how many people would use active transportation, mile for mile. That's a straight up savings on GHG. So I'm going to show you just one slide on performance metrics. The first set of metrics under the connectivity goal, and I've highlighted in bold that we do have a metric of miles of trails or multi-use paths. We went big on this. Brian's work to develop that conceptual map. We just built the whole thing. This is how many miles you would have. And we did our best, the best we could based on available data to estimate current trail mileage, which is where Brian then can derive that incredible past investment, thanks to your work and local jurisdictions and everybody who's invested in trails. And of 1,600 miles or so, and we are looking, by the way, at paved trails. These are generally trails that you can say are definitely going to be a transportation function as well. This is not a backcountry or soft surface trail in most cases. And WSDOT directly only manages about 38 miles. We work with partners on the rest of them. Besides measuring the direct what happens, we also are proposing to do equity checks. And we had this in the works before the HEAL Act came out that the legislature passed in the last session, but this really relates very directly. And this slide is an example of doing an equity check on the safety metrics. So I mentioned before, we don't always know all of the demographic characteristics of an individual if they're injured. We do, however, have what shows up in the federal database if they're killed. And so we can take fatality statistics, look at the census grouping that's recorded in the federal database and say, is that proportionate to how many folks live in the state? So if everything were equal, this sounds really grand, but if everything were equal, we would die in the same numbers that we live in Washington, proportionately. So that's not what's happening. Back to our disproportionate outcomes. So for example, if you look at people who show up in the federal database as American Indian or Alaska Native, they make up 2% of our population, but they are 5% of the fatalities. So that is out of proportion. The same is true for Black Washingtonians, for Hispanic Washingtonians. The inverse is true for white Washingtonians, that we make up 70% of the population and only 65% of the deaths. So equity checks will let us see whether we are doing all that we can to make up for those past decisions and actions and unintended consequences that I mentioned. That's performance metrics kind of in a nutshell, some numbers and cross checks on how well we make progress for everybody. Now I'll turn to the strategies. And I will say the strategies feel very WSDOT-y. They are, many of them are about our internal processes, but genuinely for any jurisdiction, you could pick out WSDOT and put in the name of your city or your town or your county or your port district or whatever and say, this might apply to us too. How are we doing at this thing? Could we do this strategy? Could we carry this out? And some strategies could have been under more than one goal, or there's a specific facet of it under one goal and another facet under another goal. So definitely not perfect, definitely a draft, definitely need your comments on these. And again, no timelines or deadlines because of ties to funding. And some strategies we can fit into ongoing work. It's for us as an agency, we would revise that work going forward to incorporate principles from the active transportation plan. So as you read that, if you want to rewrite the whole chapter and send in really long comments, I'm not sure the formal allows for that, but please comment freely. Are these the strategies that feel like ones that will improve active transportation, working towards our goals? Are they the right strategies at this point in time, given what we know? Would you add or would you revise, or you'd say, actually don't even try that yet. You're not ready for that. Save that for later. And we list some sample actions. I'm going to give you a few examples of these, just to give you an idea of what do we mean when we say this is the strategy. How would we then execute on something to be moving towards that goal in the implementation phase? This plan is not the implementation plan. And we get comments that say, oh, I want to know exactly who's leading that committee, or convening those meetings or writing that manual or whatever it is. This isn't that plan. This is the broad direction. But if you do have specific actions, and that's where I hope we have some robust Q&A and chat comments, what is it that WSDOT can do to be a better partner to trail development, where you know that your trail is one that contributes to transportation corridors, whether it's in town or between towns and places. So comment. So some examples of our strategies, and I picked out some of the ones that relate most directly to trails. But again, if you just search on the word trail, you'll find it, by the way, I did it this morning, 88 times in the draft. Some of those are footnotes, but many of those are in the main text. And but that's not all that relates to trails. So really, we appreciate you taking time to review the whole thing. Under connectivity, one of the strategies, as an example, is to coordinate with partners for development of infrastructure across jurisdictional boundaries. So this is actually building connections. And so a sample of an action for us here is to participate in that statewide trails planning that we're already doing. There's a couple of these that do feel like you're going to write your to-do list and you're going to put something on it you already did so you can check it off. But we want to note this is an important activity going forward to keep doing. We have data gaps, and so a sample action is for us to really participate database, and that's not a small thing. We don't have complete data, so ourselves as an agency on some of these pieces that we own, so we need to get that moving forward. And to improve connectivity through building things. One of the things you might have thoughts or comments about either today or commenting on the plan is the administrative processes that we have as an agency about connecting across our right-of-way. How can we make it easier and better to connect on and across state right-of-way where we need to for continuity of a trail system or the overall active transportation network? There's also a discussion section in the plan that you might have some thoughts on, because trails are sort of a unique animal, kind of like bicycles are a unique vehicle in state code, that there are ways in which they are treated as recreational facilities for purposes of recreational immunity and management and ownership. And there are also ways that trails are treated as transportation corridors. And I like to note that when we as an agency are counting vehicle trips, we don't count RVs separately from sedans and sport utility vehicles. We just count that a box went by. So when we think about trails, I personally want us to think about trails as a way to get someplace. But that's a complex sort of legal and statutory question. So take a look at that section, see how we did with that. Did we miss a really important point people need to understand about how trails fit into transportation? Turning now to our safety sample strategies and trail actions. As always, the goal will be to achieve 0 serious injury and fatal crashes. And we measure those specific to people who are walking or rolling or cycling, but that's the goal for the whole state for all modes. But the line to achieve that goal gets steeper every year. So we want to increase our ability to create and manage the facilities that are lower LTS. And again, we're starting with what we have. So one of the sort of boring, wonky things that's really important for us is that we actually account for active transportation facilities as assets that we own and manage. And we already have started work on this internally, that if we own and manage something that's a level of traffic stress 1 or 2, that's an existing condition to preserve. We want to make sure we do no harm to something that's already as good as we can make it. So I just want to stay on track with that. The second strategy listed here is talking about maintaining access through really 2 separate kinds of things. One is during weather events. And I know I've gotten emails probably from some of you about things like sweeping trails when a lot of leaves are down this time of year and they're wet and they're slippery. When lights go out and it's getting darker earlier. When snow is plowed, is the snow plowed in a way that leaves the trail clear, or did the trail become the snow storage spot? So how do we deal with weather events so that active transportation can stay connected, stay accessible, which is really critical under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then the second ways of thinking about maintaining active transportation access is to think about those short duration events like construction projects and maintenance activities and that kind of thing, making sure we keep a good marked path through the work zone, or we've done a good job of identifying the detour and making it not so far out of direction that you can't do it. Because for some people, active transportation is their transportation. And this plan really says we need to keep that understanding foremost. In our opportunity section, we didn't label it equity, but there's a lot of work on equity and transportation justice under this strategy and goal area, but it's really access to opportunities as well that we want to think about. And so one of the things that we include as a strategy is updating our own practices on how we manage our competitive funding programs. And for those who might have been at the Leafline Trails Coalition conference a couple weeks ago, I did a presentation and was part of the panel on funding, and I won't repeat what I said there, but we every 2 years are able to award whatever the legislature sets as the funding level for Safe Routes to School and the Pedestrian Bicyclist Program. If you go back to the beginning of these programs in 2005, we have over $1 billion of project applications that came in that we could not fund. So it's a highly competitive program. The legislature has asked us to report how we would change it to increase the diversity of jurisdictions that participate, both in application and selection. The more jurisdictions that apply, the more competitive this is going to become. And that will be part of the report. We're writing that now, so watch for that. That'll be a public document, and we'll have it on the web when it's done. So that's just something to keep in mind as you think maybe about how to get funding for trails is where are we going? And it will be equity and safety. In our participation sample strategies, one of the interesting areas, and I would say, I don't know that we're going to jump on it right away because there are so many, but looking at wayfinding and signage, that I would say at this point, if you are a driver and you're heading across the state and you're on I-90, you know when you get to Ellensburg that there's a business loop and that you could get off and you know if there's a gas station in the Quiznos or whatever. Like the signage for drivers is very complete. In some locations, you would find a sign that tells you that there's a trail that you could access. But if you're traveling, do you really know, is that trail close enough that I could use it as part of my network, my route? Or it might be 5 miles off the highway and we're just telling you about it because it's a destination. And the assumption has been that you're driving to that destination. So we want to thoughtfully consider how we handle wayfinding and signage on the state system. And then as a second strategy, be collaborating with our partners on what are the trail signage standards. And this came up partly because we commented at length on the MUTCD, boring wonky thing, but the rules for traffic signs say that trail signs can't reflect local culture or branding, and we didn't like that. So we want to do better than that in the state. I'm going to quickly fly through the partnership sample strategies. I want to get to your next steps and have some time for conversation. We want to strengthen our partnership mechanisms, do more conversations about how we all know where we need connections and crossings. And so we're aligning around shared priorities and projects and have mechanisms for that all the time. Not sporadic, not spot plans, but a big picture plan. And how do we make it easier to get to agreements around things like either projects or maintenance? Our next steps on the plan are we get all the comments that come in by, again, midnight tomorrow night, October 29th. We will review those. We consider all comments. We are then going to do the revisions based on the comments, and we'll combine these chapters with part 1 so that we can publish one giant thorough active transportation plan. Then we start working on our implementation plan, a formal plan for that. That's an internal document for us, but we'll have a schedule for our regular cycle of updating the state plan, because this one really focused on engineering, and there are other topics like education and encouragement that we want to dig into. Your next steps, your mission, should you choose to accept, is to comment. And if you don't do anything else, open it up and look at Appendix G and make sure we have your plan link and that it is the right link to the current version of any plan that considers active transportation facilities. So you know, this could be a trails plan, open space plan, port district plan, city, county, whatever it might be. And then I want to point people also to the highway system plan, which we have as an agency open. There is a survey open, and we'll put that link into the chat. How would you allocate $3 billion in state transportation budget? And it's got some sliders and options and photographs to illustrate different levels of spending. Some categories have a fixed minimum because those are amounts that have already been set in adoption of past transportation budgets. So some things you can't go down lower than the bottom number, but would still love to have you take that. We have an e-news you can subscribe to. We'll put that link in the chat. And then when you go to the online open house for the Active Transportation Plan Part 2, we have, if you scroll down far enough, you'll find 3 videos we made. And one of them, certainly some of you would know Ian McKay, who lives on the Olympic Peninsula. He talked about the importance of trails to his personal freedom and transportation independence and joy and health. And so that's one of the videos, but you can use that as a spot to drop a link to your own story if you've told your own story somewhere, or just a comment on these stories. We hope you'll do that as well. So I'll stop there and we'll look at chat and Q&A boxes. And looks like there's been one that got, let me see, did it get answered in text is my question. Yes, Brian took care of that. So for those who can't see chat, because not everybody can, there was a question about the criteria and process to prioritize project implementation. And for a long time, there's been this sort of user demand, user counts approach, and focused on congestion and safety for motorists. And if we did active transportation work, it was tied to a project that's being done for drivers. What we're shifting to is talking about network connectivity. So it wouldn't be, we can already count you there. It would be, do you need to be there? Because user counts, you can't be counted if you can't be there. Again, back to Disability Rights Washington, they noted that if you don't build it, they can't come. So we're going to look at our data to prioritize around equity and latent demand, potential demand based on having destinations and safety. And we want a complete network. And we don't have the money for it. I have to say that part. All right. Any comments or thoughts in chat? There we go. Okay, there's a question that showed up in chat. I've got to scroll back up now. Let's see. And again, we will save the chat and Q&A so that we can fold this into our feedback on draft 2 as well. And there's a question about class 2 and 3 e-bikes and whether that changed the level of traffic stress on trails. No, trails, level of traffic stress is a facilities measure. It's not a psychological measure about how you feel sharing the trail with someone. So the fact that it is separated, that you're not on a bike lane with a stripe of paint that'll keep somebody from hitting you, quote unquote. So a trail stays at LTS 1 generally. The crossings might change. And I will say, as an e-bike owner, if the concern is about speed, the speed at which somebody travels isn't tied to it being an e-bike. I'm married to somebody who races and trains and can go a lot faster without an E than I can with my E. So, so that's a trail etiquette question for all of us to consider in sharing with various uses, including equestrian. I saw one up there. There's an interesting detailed question that we're going to have to take back and do some research on about how an RCO sponsor would know if your project is on a non-highway road, which depends on whether WSDOT funding went into it. So we will do some research on that. And there was a comment about considering the presence of equestrians as well, and appreciate that note. The language about trail access on state right-of-way, my understanding is that actually might have even come from backcountry horsemen to begin with. I'm not sure, but that it started out as an equestrian section of code, and then they added pedestrians and bicyclists. Kind of how trails work too, right? People walked or rode horses before bicycles were invented. So appreciate that note about safety of folks using horses along state right-of-way. And there is a question about to what extent trail etiquette and outdoor ethics are included in the planning process. And I think that's a great question. And that's where this plan is the first of other plan updates to come. This really focused on engineering because we didn't have the data. We didn't have those quantitative metrics that I can use within the agency to say, did we make it better? Here's what better is. When our division got started 4.5 years ago, what I heard from colleagues was we want to do the right thing, but we need to know what the right thing looks like. And so that's what this gives them, is a methodology and approaches and analysis. So it does engineering very thoroughly. In future updates, we would speak to things like, what are the needs around education or encouragement? And this is an important one where I think RCO might take the lead on trail etiquette broadly, and then we could partner with them on materials or outreach, whatever that might look like, as well as the Traffic Safety Commission, working with drivers about trail crossings. I see a question about how engaged or consulted with tribes in the development of the draft ATP, and that's a great question. WSDOT has ongoing consultation with tribal leadership. We presented several times to the Tribal Transportation Planning Organization, and we have designated tribal representatives on our stakeholder committee. And anytime something goes out for public comment, there is a specific routing of the plan to tribes, and they have a specific window that we always honor for the length of time that they have to comment. And we extend our comment period if necessary to make sure that tribes have time to comment. That is a great question. And if you look at part 1, you'll find discussion of the Yakima Nation's Heritage Connectivity Trail concept as an example of what we learn and incorporate in the plan based on consulting with tribes. All right. Yeah, and there's a great question from Larry Levine about how last year traffic volume went down and serious injury and death went up. And the final numbers for 2020 are a little bit different on that. It was a strange trade-off, like serious injuries went down, but death went up a little bit early on. Roads were emptier and drivers could go faster is part of the answer, we think. That roads that were designed for high-speed travel, you might get slowed down if there's a bunch of other drivers in front of you, but if all the other drivers stayed home and teleworked that day, you have a wide, straight, inviting stretch of road, and you flex that ankle and away you go. And so that is why speed management is one of our primary tools going forward, that we laid it out in part 1 about what it would cost to use speed management on state routes that are in those places that are like towns, that you shouldn't be driving like it's a highway if you're on somebody's main street. And so another example of where we've identified the cost. We will do what we can within existing resources and look to our local partners to also prioritize speed limit reductions, which has happened in Seattle. They're lowering the speed limit in the city. And so we've worked with them to lower the posted speed on a number of stretches of state route. Still gonna have to do some redesign to really slow the drivers down because they are responding to the design cues that they are given. We all do that one way or another. All right, so I'm checking the chat and also checking time. I think we've got a couple more minutes to do questions. So I'm going to keep scrolling through. Roundabouts, some are better than others for trails. Yes, they are. Some are better than others for pedestrians who might need to find a gap in traffic. And if you're a blind pedestrian and you cannot see oncoming traffic, how will you be able to find that point at which to cross? So yes, we are digging into roundabout design. They do serve to slow drivers. The rounder they are, the more they slow the driver. And we'll be looking at things like how should a bicyclist interact and what can we do about those crossings. All right. And then there's some very trail specific questions in specific locations that I want to take back to my region and follow up on. So again, we are going to save and get from our hosts all the questions and answers and a copy of the chat. And so we'll do some individual follow-up to make sure we get to all of those. So, sorry, I'm juggling both little windows here. All right. I think that we have taken care of both questions and comments. So again, we will follow up on specific questions. If you want to get an answer, you could drop your email into the Q&A too, just to make sure we've got it. Very interesting question, and I'm actually not sure how to do this one. How are slow moving vehicle lanes considered for highway development? And if by slow moving vehicles, if you mean bicycles, people on bikes, I need a little more help on what that question is about. How has here's another great question. How has turning stop signs into yield signs for bicyclists turned out? So far, so good, although I don't know that we would have, I don't know that if there were a collision, honestly, I will need to find out if the traffic collision report would actually note whether or not the bicyclist action involved using the safety stop. The traffic collision reports don't collect a lot of data for us. So far, so good as far as what's come to my attention or somebody has said something about. And for those who are not familiar with the safety stop, I'm going to do the fastest job I can to find a link on that, or Brian might be able to. Okay, so Kathy clarified, thank you, Kathy, on that slow moving vehicles, large trucks and horse trailers and large container truck and trailer rigs. Honestly, that's not an active transportation thing I need to deal with, so I don't know. You know, other than knowing that state law says if you're holding up 5 or more drivers, you're supposed to pull out. And so that's when I've got to refer to my friends who plan the wider lanes. And if I will drop our email in the chat, or our just our kind of our central email. All right. So this is an email for follow-up if you want to send your question to us directly. And again, we've got the Q&A captured. So with that, I think I will remind you one more time that the deadline for commenting on the draft plan is tomorrow night, October 29th at midnight. And then you'll see a final plan come out, and we'll keep going, and we will continue to have engagement and opportunity and teaching on principles in the active transportation plan.